Now, 3 centuries of press freedom are in jeopardy, newspaper bosses say, after MPs rejected the industry's proposals to get its house in order. The victims of press intrusion fear, though, that the politicians are about to water down plans for state-backed control of the press after promising to publish revised proposals on Friday. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
The convulsion over phone hacking, how to regulate the press, the public hearings, demonstrations and debates were supposed to be resolved in one peaceful meeting of the centuries-old Privy Council. The plan was the Queen, with her Privy Councillors, traditional stand, would give her consent for a royal charter to take off the once-and-for-all solution to the age-old problem, how to keep the press to rules, but free. The problem is the papers don't like the form of self-regulation that the 3 main parties have set up. The government's in danger of setting up a press self-regulation club that none of the press wants to join. And there's another problem. Buckingham Palace doesn't like lending the royal tag to things that are controversial. And when you've got a self-regulation model that the newspapers are saying is a dramatic curb on press freedom, well, it doesn't get more controversial than that. So David Cameron, meeting the European Union Council President today, has decided to pause the whole process. He wants to see if there's a compromise that can be worked out with the press. But Labour and the Lib Dems have insisted it can only be a limited rethink. And that's what the Culture Secretary announced this afternoon.
We have an opportunity here, I believe, Mr. Speaker, to take a final look at our charter, an opportunity to bring all parties together and ensure that the final charter is both workable and effective.
Amongst the remaining disagreements, the press don't like the idea of a compulsory complaint or dispute arbitration procedure. They want a voluntary one. They don't like the idea of the regulator being able to direct or order apologies or corrections in their newspapers. And they don't like the idea of diluting their presence on some of the self-regulation committees. But the Labour and Lib Dem leaderships have insisted to the Tories they'll only allow renegotiation on the committee lineups and on whether there should be some sort of charge for people wanting to take a complaint to arbitration.
The committee has identified 2 substantive areas: access to arbitration and the editor's code, where we could improve what's in the 18th of March draft. All 3 parties agree that these areas could benefit from further consideration.
We understand that there are some small technical changes still to be made. This is regrettable, but we will be watching closely to ensure that there is no dilution whatsoever of what Lord Justice Leveson recommended.
Newspaper bosses said they'd carry on setting up their own body, even though all 3 main parties today said the press self-regulation plans weren't independent enough or credible with the public.
Well, earlier I spoke to the editor of Private Eye, Ian Hislop, who opposes any state involvement in regulating the press, and Baroness Hollins, a crossbench peer whose daughter Abigail Witchells was left paralysed by a knife attack. I started by asking her about her experience with the press after that attack.
Well, there was extraordinary press interest, media interest in her, in what had happened to her, and actually in her bravery in surviving and just her courage. But the intrusion by the press was extraordinarily difficult to cope with, including press doorstepping, telephoto lenses, all manner of intrusion, not just for kind of the family immediately around her, but including for her grandmother, for example, who was living 200 miles away and was terminally ill with cancer. And we had at one point to call police to ask them to remove a journalist who was refusing to go without photographs of my daughter. And do you know what was perhaps the most difficult was that the stories that were printed in the press, although they were kindly enough, were not true, most of them. And it only took 2 words from one neighbour or one person for a whole lot of information to be taken off the internet and regurgitated as if it was new, which in my world we'd call plagiarism.
Can victims of press intrusion trust the press to get their own house in order?
My point to Leveson was all the way through, the law needs to be enforced. And we have laws in this country. about harassment and about libel, and we have a lot of laws in this country, and we don't need any more from politicians. So, I mean, it's a fairly simple position. That is where I stand.
Baroness Hollins, could you have used existing laws to tackle the intrusion that you faced? I mean, you talked about calling the police, for example. How were not existing laws adequate?
Look, the last thing you want is to have to start using the law and finding out what the law is when you're in the middle of a family situation like I described. So, do you know, freedom of the press is something I absolutely agree with. What is being proposed by the cross-party charter is not state regulation. This time, I think it's time to act. And the idea is not to interfere with freedom, but to expect the press to behave responsibly. And any regulator which is set up, and indeed the press are free to propose a regulator, but it must be Leveson compliant. And the only thing which is in place...
Well, again, I mean, I don't want to disagree with, you know, the mother of a victim. I mean, no one wants to look worse on this than necessary, but Leveson compliant doesn't necessarily mean anything. There are huge sections of Leveson that don't make any sense. Some of them are nonsense. Some of them have been dropped already. There is no simple answer to this, and it is no good saying that people who are arguing that the press must be free haven't got the point, don't understand, or are indulging in a parody, or that we are callous and unsympathetic to the victims. Nor is it fair to say, particularly in people in my own case, that we're not aware of the bad behaviour of the press. My magazine has spent about 40 years running examples of the way in which the press misbehaved. And this week we have a new set of rather furious people who are complaining about the behaviour of the press. I mean, the press is not pretty, but it is free. And it is no good saying we have got in place systems that will ensure that regulation doesn't make the press not free. It is unintended consequences. And if you look at all the precedents for state regulation, they are very bad. Everyone starts out with just a little bit of regulation, just a dab, just a hint of it here and there, and it ends up with politicians deciding what goes into the press. And that is a principle which I and a very large number of other people, this isn't an unpopular view, think is dangerous.
But if you lay the two proposals side by side, the press proposals and the politicians' proposals, to the lay person, there's not a great deal of difference between them, is there?
And I suppose if they can sort that out, that is what this delay will be for. But again, I was not privy to any of these discussions, either late at night in Miliband's office or from the mainstream press. And what we have on the table is a thing saying that if you don't join up to the regulator, even if you lose a libel case, you will pay all the costs. Even if we win, even if we're telling the truth, we're going to be fined because the politicians want to regulate us. That, I think, is unacceptable. And that's just one anomaly in any number in this fudge and mess that has come out.
Hislop and Baroness Hollins talking earlier.